I want you not to scroll past this. Not because it's a sad story, but because it begins with a box that held both the cruelty and the kindness of humankind. That night, the rain came down, as if Bakersfield itself was trying to wash away someone's sins. The wind slapped my face sharp and cold, and through the noise of it, I heard something faint, weak, broken, almost like the cry of a creature running out of breath. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again, longer this time, trembling. I raised my flashlight. The beam swept across old trash cans, rusted metal bars, and stopped on a soaked cardboard box lying against a brick wall. On its lid, scrawled in red letters that bled under the rain, were the words, "Sick. Do not touch." My heart went cold. I stepped closer, my boots sinking into the mud. With every step, that tiny sound grew weaker. I lifted the lid, and what I saw in that moment is something I will never forget for the rest of my life. Inside was a Doberman puppy no bigger than my hand, its body covered in warts and bleeding sores. It was curled up, trembling violently as if trying to make itself small enough to disappear. Its eyes were wide, clear, innocent, and filled with the kind of fear only something pure can feel when it doesn't understand why it's being punished. And I swear, in that instant, I understood something. The person who wrote "Do not touch" wasn't afraid of disease. They were afraid of responsibility. If you think humans can only be cruel in war, I thought, look inside this box. My name is Henry Walsh. I'm 58 years old, and I live alone on the outskirts of Bakersfield. I've worked my whole life as a mechanic, fixing tractors for the farmers around here. I thought I'd seen enough of life's ugliness until that night when I lifted that fragile body out of the box. The rain was pouring, the wind stung my face, but in my arms was a warmth fading fast. Its skin burned with fever, and the stench of infection hung thick like scorched metal. I could feel every broken breath short, weak. Then nothing. I shook it gently, my voice trembling. "Hey, little one, stay with me." No response. Just a faint sniffle, half whimper, half breath. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I didn't fear disease. I only knew one thing: this puppy would not die in a trash box. I wrapped my jacket around it and ran to my truck. When I set it on the seat, it was so light it felt like holding ashes. The streetlights slid across its face, red rough patches covering its head and neck. Every tiny movement cracked its skin, and beads of blood welled up. The 24-hour vet clinic was 7 miles away. I drove through the storm, one hand on the wheel, the other pressed over its chest, praying for a heartbeat. The door burst open as Dr. Grace Mitchell, a thin woman with her hair tied high, ran out. She looked at me, then at the creature in my coat, and whispered, "Oh my God." She laid it on the table. Under the harsh fluorescent light, I could see every scab, every crusted wound. Grace examined quickly, then said, "Papillomavirus. Severe case. Likely starved for a week. He's very young." My voice cracked. "Can you save him?" She met my eyes, her words slow and heavy. "If he still wants to live." I stood there drenched, my heart pounding like a hammer, watching that tiny body tremble under the white towel. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just angry, I was furious. Not at the sickness. The person who could write "Do not touch" and then walk away. I bent down, resting my hand on the puppy's head. "No one's ever going to leave you again. You hear me?" I whispered. It didn't move. But I saw it, a small twitch in its ear, a faint, fragile sign, as if it heard me. Fan 2. I left the clinic close to midnight. The rain hadn't stopped, just softened, the kind of slow, lingering rain that makes every sound feel distant, like it's coming from another world. Dr. Grace said, "Henry, if you want to try caring for him, keep him warm. Feed him milk drop by drop, but don't expect too much. His body's very weak." I nodded and took the little dog home. He lay wrapped in a white towel, wheezing eyes shut tight. I set him on the chair beside the fireplace and turned on a dim yellow lamp so the room wouldn't fall completely dark. The house, usually silent now, held just 2 rhythms of breath, mine, and another faint, fading one. The air smelled of ointment milk and rain. I warmed my hands over the fire, then gently placed one on his belly, warm but uneven. Each time he tried to inhale, his chest shuddered as if pierced by invisible needles. I listened to the rain tapping on the tin roof, and under it I could hear the wall clock ticking each second, sounding like a quiet countdown to an ending I didn't want to face. I mixed warm milk, drew it into a small syringe, and touched it lightly to his mouth. He flinched, then opened his jaws by reflex. A single drop slid down his throat, and he started coughing so weakly I had to lean close just to hear it. Blood beaded on his lip. I wiped it quickly. "It's okay. You're okay, little one." He lay, still breathing fast and shallow, and then his chest stopped moving. I froze. My heart went cold. I placed my hand on his chest, no pulse. For a second, I forgot to breathe. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I rubbed his chest, then blew softly through his nose. Once, twice, no response. "No. No, you can't go like this." I whispered, hands slick with sweat. I pressed his chest to the rhythm of the clock, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then a tiny gasp. So small it sounded like the pop of a bottle cap. I stopped, leaned closer. His chest lifted. Once, then again. I cried not out of joy, but out of pure fear. I'd never been that terrified of losing a life so quickly. He was breathing again, weak but steady. I wrapped him tighter in the towel and moved him closer to the fire. My eyes burned, maybe from the smoke, maybe from exhaustion, maybe from tears. I sat there back against the wall, my hand still resting on him, whispering like a prayer to no one. "You're not dying in my hands. Not tonight. Not ever." Outside, thunder rolled away into the distance. The fire cast our shadows onto the wall, an old man with silver hair, and a small creature cradled in his arms, both trembling in the fragile warmth between them. Around 3 a.m., I woke with a start. The room was quiet, except for the soft crackle of the fire. I leaned down and saw he wasn't lying still anymore. His little head was resting on my hand. I couldn't tell if it was by accident or intent, but his eyes had opened, slightly black, and glistening like beads, staring right at me. I held my breath. Those eyes didn't hold life yet, but they held will. The look of something that had been to the edge and wasn't ready to let go. I whispered, "You're stronger than I am, kid. Stronger than I'll ever be." For the first time, I felt something beyond compassion. It was a connection, a fragile, invisible thread binding 2 lonely souls together. I stayed awake until dawn. The sky outside the window shifted from gray to soft orange. The first light touched his fur, the red patches glimmered faintly, almost like glitter. Ugly, painful, but beautiful in its own way. When Grace called to ask how he was doing, I simply said, "He's still here." My voice was hoarse, but deep down I knew we had made it through the worst. I hadn't named him yet. I'd thought of 100 names through the night, but none felt right. Then, as the sunlight filtered through the curtains, I murmured Arlo. "I'll call you Arlo." Not because it sounded nice, but because in Old Norse, Arlo means light in the darkness. And that's exactly what he was. That night in my small house, between the smell of milk and the sound of rain, a tiny light began to live again. And 3 days had passed since that night. Arlo had started taking a few spoonfuls of milk each morning. Every time I touched his head, his tiny ears would twitch, a faint reflex of a new trust beginning to form. I didn't talk much. I just worked, cooked, and sat by the fireplace reading the paper, letting him listen to the soft rustle of the pages instead of the harsh sounds from outside. On the fourth morning, I took him back to the clinic. Grace came out holding a clipboard, her gentle smile like the first thin sunlight of winter. "He's still alive, Henry," she said, and stronger than I expected. She injected antibiotics and rewrapped a few swollen spots, but when she lifted the fur around his neck, she paused. "Wait," she murmured, frowning, pointing to a faint mark just below his throat. There, beneath the short fur, was a thin, pale groove, the scar of a rope. An old wound healed, but still unmistakable. I swallowed hard. "What does that mean?" Grace's voice dropped low. "Someone tied him up, for sure, maybe to keep him from crawling out of the box." The room seemed to tilt. I looked at Arlo, sleeping, breathing softly, his little paws twitching as if he were dreaming. And in my mind, I saw it clearly, someone, maybe his owner, tying up a newborn pup, stuffing him into a box, scribbling "sick, do not touch" on top, and walking away. That's when I realized the worst thing isn't abandonment. It's knowing something is suffering and doing it anyway. Grace spoke quietly. If he made it here, it means he crawled on his own. Maybe someone left the box near the road, the wind tipped it over, and he crawled out looking for shelter. I said nothing. Bakersfield had its share of poor folks, but poverty is never an excuse for cruelty. That afternoon, I drove to the south side of town, where I'd first found the box. The road was still littered with trash. The torn box lay where it had been. No rain this time, but the smell of dampness still hung thick in the air. I walked slowly around the area, a few run-down houses, front yards cluttered with old cars, windows boarded up. An older man was dumping garbage down the street. "Sir," I asked, "did you see anyone drop off a puppy here last week?" He shrugged, cigarette hanging from his lips. "Yeah, a woman, silver pickup. She stopped, tossed a box out, and left." I pressed on. "Did she say anything?" He exhaled smoke, mumbled something. "No choice left." Then drove off. "No choice left." Those words hit me like a blade, not an apology, not even pity, just exhaustion and surrender. A verdict on a life that never had a chance to defend itself. Later that evening, when I got home, I saw Arlo lying by the window. The last rays of daylight brushed across his bright brown eyes, turning them into tiny embers in the cold room. He saw me and tried to lift his head, wagging his tail weakly. Just a small movement, but it stopped my breath. I sat down on the floor, letting him rest his head on my hand. My voice trembled as I whispered, "You didn't deserve that. No one ever does." Arlo opened his eyes, looking at me, and I swear he understood. There was no anger there, only something light and pure, a fragile belief in a world that had already hurt him. I smiled, then sighed. "You know, Arlo, I once had a son. He was 1 month old." The words slipped out like a dam breaking. I'd never told anyone, not friends, not neighbors. Car accident, a rainy night, and now another rainy night. Another small life lying in my hands, weak but alive. "Maybe you were sent here," I whispered, "to teach me how to hold on again. When something starts to slip away." Outside, the wind stirred the birch trees. Dry leaves spun in circles, dancing across the porch light. I sat there, my hand resting gently on his head, feeling his breathing slow and steady. And for the first time in years, this house didn't feel empty anymore. Sometimes, all it takes is a fragile breath, a quiet gaze, to make the darkness inside finally begin to fade. Fan 4. Saturday morning. Weak sunlight slipped through the old curtains in my living room. Arlo was curled up in a small blanket beside the fireplace, breathing steadily but still tired. I set my coffee on the table and sat down beside him. Every time I looked at that little soul, I felt like I was staring at the last piece of myself that still refused to give up fragile trembling, but still clinging to life in every way it could. For the past 3 days, he'd been able to drink a few spoonfuls of thin milk mixed with vitamins. The wounds on his skin were starting to dry, but his mouth remained swollen, making it hard for him to swallow. Grace had said, if Arlo can keep this up for another week, we'll have a real chance. Those words felt like a miracle, and I held on to them the way a drowning man clings to the last bit of driftwood in a black sea. That afternoon, I went to the farmer's market downtown. I brought a few pictures of Arlo, one from the day I found him and one from now. I only meant to buy some goat's milk, but somehow I ended up telling the story to the woman behind the counter, and then to the person beside her. A middle-aged woman, after hearing it, placed a hand on her chest. "Oh my God," she said. "Who could ever do something like that to such a tiny creature?" She asked if she could share Arlo's story on the local community group. I nodded, not thinking much of it. But that night, when I opened my phone, I froze. Hundreds of comments, hundreds of prayers. People were sharing Arlo's story everywhere. Some sent milk. Others asked for my address to donate medicine. An elderly man wrote, "I used to be a veterinarian. If you need me, I'll drive 200 miles to help." And in one night, my quiet little house became a small center of hope. The feeling was strange, not loud, not grand. Just the quiet certainty that there were still people who wouldn't turn away. The next morning, while I was mixing his milk, Arlo did something I never expected. He stood up. His legs trembled, but he stood. He wobbled toward me, head low, tail swaying softly. I froze, watching that tiny body fight gravity one step at a time. "What are you doing, kid?" I whispered, smiling through the tightness in my throat. He looked up, lips quivering, and let out the faintest bark I'd ever heard. It was thin, raspy, almost like the wind, but it was a bark. His first one. And I, a 60-year-old man who thought his heart had long gone dry, cried like a child. But life has a way of testing you the moment you start to hope. That afternoon, Arlo suddenly stopped eating. He curled up, panting fast, sweat beading on his muzzle. I called Grace immediately. She arrived 15 minutes later with her medical kit. "He might be reacting to the meds," she said gently. "But don't panic, Henry. Sometimes the body weakens before it gets stronger." We gave him a fever shot. All night I sat beside him listening to every breath. Just before dawn, he opened his eyes again and nudged his head into my palm. I laughed, my voice breaking. "Yeah, I know. You're not one to give up easily." 2 days later, Grace sent me a message. "The community wants to know if you'll allow them to start a small rescue fund in Arlo's name." I looked at the screen, then at the little dog sleeping nearby. He was still the same fragile trembling, but his breath in my hand was warm. I nodded, not for the money, but because Arlo had become a symbol of something we'd forgotten for too long, compassion that doesn't need a reason. The next day, a package arrived at my door. Inside was a tiny, knitted sweater, a bag of milk, and a handwritten note for Arlo, because he reminded me that kindness still exists. My hands shook as I folded the note. I looked out the window. Bakersfield's sky was startlingly blue. When I turned back, Arlo was asleep, chest rising and falling, his black and brown coat shimmering in the sunlight. I whispered, "Look at you, kid. The whole world's cheering for you now." He didn't respond, but his tail twitched just once as if he understood. And that's when I realized, sometimes miracles don't come from magic, but from hearts that beat together for a single fragile life. Phenom. 3 weeks after the community first learned about Arlo, he was much stronger. His weight had nearly doubled, his eyes were brighter, and every time I walked into the room he'd rise to his feet, tail wagging slowly as if to say hello. But the larger warts had begun to spread again around his neck, his mouth, a few even bleeding anew. Grace spoke with quiet seriousness. "It's time, Henry. We need to operate. If we don't, the virus will win." I said nothing. I knew she was right. Arlo was strong enough for anesthesia, but not strong enough for more pain. Still, there was no other choice. That morning, the sky over Bakersfield was gray, the wind carrying a faint scent of dust. I placed Arlo inside the small basket lined with his favorite old blanket. He lifted his head, ears, drooping eyes, asking, "Where are we going?" I tried to smile. "To a place that'll make you better." "Kid," I whispered. On the drive to the clinic, I couldn't say a word. Only the sound of the tires on wet asphalt and his tiny claws tapping softly against the basket wall. Each tap felt like a heartbeat against my chest, reminding me that today was a battle between life and death. When we arrived, Grace was already waiting with 2 assistants. She crouched down, stroked his head, and said gently, "Hey, little warrior, you ready?" He licked her hand, then turned his eyes toward me. I lifted him up my hands, trembling so much they felt hollow. "Hang in there," I said. "I'll be right here when you wake up." Grace nodded, pushing through the door to the operating room. The soft click of the door hinge closing left a hollow sound in my chest. I sat on the wooden bench outside, and my heart pounding like machinery in overdrive. Through the frosted glass, I could see the glow of the surgical light. Grace's silhouette bent low, moving quickly, precisely. The monitor beeped, steady, rhythmic, each tone stretching my nerves tighter. Then, suddenly, the sound broke, then stopped. I jumped up, breath caught in my throat. The door stayed shut. I saw nothing but that blinding white light spilling through the glass. A storm of thoughts crashed in my head. Did his heart stop? Was it the anesthesia? Did I make a mistake saying yes? I pressed my hand against the glass, voice cracking. "Arlo, don't leave me. You hear?" Seconds passed, or maybe it was an eternity before the beeping returned. Once, twice, 3 times. I gasped, nearly collapsing back into the chair. Grace looked up, spotted me through the glass, and raised her thumb. I smiled, a wet, broken smile that tasted of relief and salt. 2 hours later, the door opened. Grace stepped out, pulling off her mask. Sweat streaked her forehead, and her voice was hoarse. "Surgery went well. We removed most of the larger warts. He's a tough little guy, Henry." I looked past her. There he was, lying on the table. A bandage wrapped around his neck. A small IV taped to his leg. I walked over, resting my hand gently on his head. His skin was cool, but his breathing was steady. "You did it, kid," I whispered. Grace stood behind me and said softly, "You know, when his heart almost stopped, I called his name. And then I saw it start beating again, like he heard me." I turned to her, unable to speak. My throat tightened as I looked down at that little creature once marked with the words, "Do not touch," now surviving because someone finally did. That night I took Arlo home. I laid him on the small bed by the fireplace and wrapped him in another blanket. He hadn't fully woken yet, but his ears twitched every time I spoke. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat beside him, listening to the soft crackle of the fire. The light danced on the wall, flickering around our shadows. "You know, Arlo," I said quietly, "I used to think miracles were just stories told in church. But tonight, I saw one, with my own hands." I placed my palm on his head and felt the warmth beneath my fingers. His heart beat slow, steady, sure. Outside, the rain began to fall gentle this time. I looked out the window, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone listening to the sound of the rain. 6. The next morning, the first light of Bakersfield slipped through the curtains, falling across the white bandage wrapped around Arlo's neck. I sat in the chair by the fireplace, a cup of coffee long gone cold. I hadn't slept much that night. I just sat there listening to his faint breathing, steady as the ticking of a clock I was terrified might stop at any moment. At 7:15, Arlo stirred. A soft whimper escaped him. Then his eyelids fluttered open. I set the cup down, my heart pounding. "Good morning, little warrior," I whispered. He blinked, tried to lift his head, but it dropped again from exhaustion. I leaned in, sliding my hand under his neck, careful not to press on the stitches. His tiny head rested in my palm, and that fragile warmth against my skin made my eyes sting. He lay there quietly, his tail twitching slightly whenever I spoke. It felt as if my voice, hoarse and trembling, was the only sound in the world he still recognized. By noon, Grace stopped by to check on him. She examined the incision and smiled. "Better than I expected. The infection hasn't spread. He's really fighting Henry." She opened her case, took out a small syringe, and handed it to me. "Twice a day. Just 1 milliliter. And Henry," she paused, her tone softening, "you've done well. Maybe, because of you, he still believes this world is worth living in." I smiled, but didn't answer. Because deep down I knew he was the reason I still believed the same. That afternoon the wind picked up. I opened the window, letting the light spill in. Arlo was strong enough to sit up now, legs trembling but holding. I set a shallow bowl of milk near him, but instead of leaning down, he looked up at me as if waiting. I understood right away. So I said softly, "Go on, eat." And just like that, he lowered his head and began to lap the milk. It was such a simple sight, yet to me it was a miracle. No music, no words, just the quiet sound of life continuing. Afterward, he crawled near the window and lay on his belly head, resting on his paws. The sunlight streamed through, turning his black and brown coat into something that glowed like warm honey. I took out my phone and snapped a photo. Not to show anyone, but to remind myself that sometimes the smallest moments, the ones we almost overlook, are the very ones that save us. 3 days later, Grace came for her final checkup. She removed the bandage, examined the scar, then nodded. "This little guy won," she said. I smiled. Not big, not loud, just the quiet kind of smile that feels like exhaling after a storm that's lasted too long. When Grace left, I took Arlo out onto the porch. In front of my house stretched a field of yellow grass, the same one that had been buried in mud that rainy night. Now the sun fell over it, warm and clean. Arlo took a few steps, legs still wobbly. Each time the wind passed, he lifted his head, ears perked, as if trying to listen to the whole world at once. Then suddenly he ran only a few yards, but enough to make me laugh out loud. He turned back, eyes bright, tail wagging, hard mouth open like he was smiling back at me. "Easy, Arlo," I called. "We're not racing." He didn't stop. Or maybe he heard me and just didn't care. Because for the first time he wasn't the sick little dog from the box. He was alive, tasting the joy that someone once tried to take from him. That night, I sat down and wrote a few lines to post on the community page. Arlo made it. "Thank you, everyone. He's proof that when you don't give up, you give miracles a chance to happen." Within hours, the post was flooded with comments. People started calling him the Miracle Pup. Someone wrote, "It's strange I read this and somehow I feel saved too." I looked over at Arlo asleep beside me, breathing steady, his small paws tucked under as if he were dreaming. And I realized every miracle begins with something small. Something as simple as not walking away when you hear a cry in the rain. Fan 7. A month after the surgery, Arlo had made a full recovery. His coat gleamed. His eyes shone bright, and every time he heard my footsteps, his tail wagged endlessly. The once quiet house now brimmed with sound, the clicking of paws across the wooden floor, the tiny barks whenever a bird landed on the porch, and my own laughter, a sound I thought had vanished from my life years ago. Grace came by one afternoon, standing in the doorway as Arlo chased his own shadow across the living room. She turned to me with a smile. "Henry," she said softly, "he's truly back. That boy was born to win." I kept my eyes on the little creature running in circles and replied, "It's not him who won. It's love that did." But I also knew love can't be something we keep just for ourselves. One evening, Grace brought news. A family in Fresno, a young couple who had lost their old dog to heart disease, had read Arlo's story online. They wanted to adopt him. They have a big yard, she said. 2 little kids who adore animals. They're not just looking for a dog, Henry. They're looking to give a soul a second chance. I sat in silence for a long while. I looked at Arlo, curled up in the sunlight, eyes half closed. I knew I couldn't keep him forever because love isn't about holding on. It's about letting something live more fully. The day I said goodbye, Bakersfield was draped in a soft rain. I carried him out to the porch, his black and brown fur speckled with drops. He lifted his head and licked my hand the same way he had that first night by the fire. "You did well, kid," I whispered. "Now it's time to show the world the miracle you are." When their car drove away, I stayed there in the rain watching until the red taillights disappeared. What I felt in my chest was strange, empty yet full, because for the first time in my life I hadn't lost something. I'd given it away. A few weeks later, Grace sent me a photo. Arlo lay by a window, sunlight warming his body. Beside him were 2 smiling children. Below it was a message from his new family. "Thank you for saving Arlo. Now he's saving us." I placed the photo on the table beside the old frame that still held my son's picture. Then I looked up. The Bakersfield sky was clear, not a trace of rain. I smiled and whispered, "Thank you, Arlo. Because of you, I've learned to believe in goodness again." I still keep that photo of Arlo on my desk right next to my son's. Each morning